Hi guys. Like Shmoon said, my name is Bill, a student at the University of Maryland, and soon to be software engineer at GoDaddy. Just got one more semester to pull through. And today I'm going to be talking to you guys about reducers, specifically reducers for Redux and React applications. And how you can sort of reduce some of the pain points that go along with writing reducers and overall decrease the amount of code that comes with writing Redux applications. So first off, does everyone here know what a reducer is? Who does not know what a reducer is? No shame. It's totally fine. Everyone knows?
Tell us anyways.
Tell us anyways. Good point. So a reducer is basically just a function that updates a value based on some sort of secondary information that it receives. So a pretty common example of that is array.reduce in JavaScript. In this example, this function takes an array, a callback function, and the initial value for an accumulator, which is the value that gets updated. And basically what happens is that the secondary information that you receive is this callback function. And you go through the array and call your callback on the accumulator and every single element of the array and update the accumulator as you go. And this leads to a new value. And usually this is done immutably, so reduce is a pure function most of the time. To show like an actual example of this in practice, let's say we just have an arbitrary array. If we wanted to use reduce to get the length of that array, the callback function that we provided would just, again, take the accumulator and an element of the array, and it would just increment the accumulator by 1 at each point. And if we initialize the accumulator to 0, calling it on this array would give us 5 because that's the length of the array. If we wanted to get the sum of the array, all we would have to do is change the callback function to accumulator plus whatever the value of the element is. So as you can see here, reducers are pretty powerful and you can do a lot of cool stuff with them. So bringing it back to the point of the talk, the reason that I wanted to talk to you guys about reducers is because of Redux. And Redux is basically a global state container for your applications. It's an implementation of Flux that basically says, okay, instead of keeping state compartmentalized in specific UI components, we're going to take all of the state and bring it out into one giant JavaScript object that you can that each individual component, regardless of where it is in the application, can query almost like a database. And so, for example, if you have a React application and you have two components that are at very far ends of the tree and are very deeply nested in the tree, instead of having to keep that state in like the nearest ancestor and have that manage the state and pass it down through each level of components, you can just access the state from whatever component you need directly, which is pretty useful. And the way that Redux updates the state after each sort of change is through reducer functions. And these reducer functions are a little bit different. The accumulator that they use in this case is actually the state of your application. So they take in the state of your application plus some secondary data and then output the next state of your application. To show an example of this, here is a pretty typical looking Redux reducer. It's pulled from the Redux documentation. And as you can see, it's just a plain JavaScript function that takes in the state of the application, which is the previous state, and an action. And your action is your sort of secondary data. And an action in Redux terms is just a plain JavaScript object that at minimum has a type property and can also have any sort of data that you want. And usually the way that Redux reducers work is that there's a switch statement that switches based on the type of action that we're receiving. So in this case, if we get an add to do action type, we'll push some object onto our state array. And if we get a toggle to do action, we'll map through the array and update one of our to do objects. This is a perfectly and if we don't find the action type that we're looking for, we just return the previous state. We don't change anything. So this is a perfectly valid way of writing Redux reducers, but people sort of hate on the switch statement syntax a lot. They don't really like it. They see it as like sort of like a boilerplatey kind of thing, and it can lead to small like typo errors and things like that. And reducing or boilerplate is such a big problem for people in the Redux community. Like people hate it so much that there's actually an entire section in the Redux documentation dedicated to reducing the amount of boilerplate that you have to write. And if you sort of go in there and take a look, there's this really cool function in the Redux documentation called create reducer. And actually, let me show you guys. Create reducer is what's called a higher order function. And a higher order function is just is a function that either takes in or receives another function, or takes in or returns another function. And in this case, create reducer is a higher order reducer. It returns a reducer function based on whatever parameters we give it. So instead of taking the previous state and an action, we give it the initial state of whatever slice of state we're working in and a handler's object. And you can think of this handler's object as sort of an object literal version of a switch statement. So the keys of this object are all the action types that we were switching on before, and the values are, you could see them as the bodies of each switch case in the previous example, just in the form of a function. And so our reducer that we're returning can see this handler's object, and it says, okay, if our action type is in this object, just call that function. And if it's not, then return the previous state, just like the regular switch statement reducer would have done. So to show what that sort of looks like in an actual reducer, here's the same to-dos reducer, but using the create reducer function instead. And you can see that it's actually pretty nice. It gets rid of a lot of like the extra words and curly braces and things like that, so you don't really have to deal with it, and it just looks cleaner. But it doesn't really eliminate that much code, and for me personally, I wasn't sure if it was worth the extra abstraction on top of reducers. So I wanted to sort of expand upon create reducer. I wanted to see if you could do more with it to help you eliminate more code. And so I came up with this library called Redux-Concise, and basically it expands upon create reducer, and instead of there being one create reducer function, there are multiple reducer creators that are sort of data structure specific within JavaScript. So now we have create array reducer, create boolean reducer, create value reducer, and create object reducer. So basically for all your basic JavaScript data structures. And the difference between these reducer creators and just the create reducer function is that they come pre-built with a lot of action handlers that handle a bunch of different common use cases. So for example, in the previous reducer, we were pushing to an array. Well, in create reducer has push built into it, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel and rewrite a push function every time you have to push to an array, which is pretty common. And all of these different reducer creators have a bunch of different default action handlers, and there's documentation. I can link it up somewhere. So you can really use this to eliminate a lot more code than you would otherwise, because not only are you getting rid of like switch statements, but you're actually getting rid of the handler functions themselves because they're already provided for you. So let's get into some examples. And so I have a few demos. I'm just going to one-hand it, I guess. So this is this is also ripped from the Redux documentation. It's a simple to-do list application. Just to show you guys how it works, it's pretty simple. You can just add a to-do item or multiple to-do items, and you can click on them to tell the app whether you've completed them or not. And you can also hide and show to-do items based on whether you've completed them or not. And all of this state is handled by two different reducers. It's handled by this to-do reducer that we've been taking a look at, and this visibility filter reducer, which tells the app which to-do list items to show. So let's just go through to-dos and see how we can refactor to-dos with Redux-Concise to basically get rid of all of this code, like literally all of it. So I'm going to import create array reducer, and just a note, what I'm going to show you right now is actually not released on NPM yet. It's like a new version. I'll probably get it released either today or tomorrow. How many of you actually looked at the library before? One guy. Thank you, Shimon. Appreciate that. It's fine. But I'm going to load this function in. And oh, Thank you. All right. Word. So let's do const to-dos. And so the arguments for all these reducer creators are exactly the same as the regular create reducer function. It's just the initial state and an object of action handlers. So we're going to do create array reducer. Empty array to start. And again, we're just going to use an object of action handlers, and the actions that we have are add to do. So let's just copy paste that. And now we need to include a handler function, which again is like the body of our switch statement. And in every single reducer creator in Redux-Concise has a handlers object within it that contains all of these default handlers. So we're going to do create array reducer dot handlers, which obviously you can use like object deconstruction if you don't want to write this every time. One-handing is hard. And push. That's it. Next, we're going to do toggle, which is a mapping, and it just so happens that create array reducer supports mapping. It's very convenient. So again, map. And that's it. That's all the refactoring for this reducer. So let's get rid of this, comment that out. Not what I wanted. Okay. And so the app at least loads, so something must have gone right. But if we try to add something, doesn't actually work. Because there is, in order for this for this magic to sort of work, there's one thing that Redux-Concise assumes about the actions that you're sending its reducers. And it follows what's called the Flux Standard Action Protocol. And all that basically means is that your actions, if you have any data outside of your type property, it needs to be kept within a payload property. That's the only difference. So let's go into our actions and find the actions that we want. So we have add to do, and so we have all of this data. And I'm just going to payload. I apologize for the one-handed typing. I wasn't expecting this. Okay, so now it's kept within our payload, and we actually need to include one more thing in this object, because if you look at our to-dos reducer, our reducer is actually adding in this completed field, which wasn't getting added into the action, so we'll just copy that over. All right. And now toggle to do, again, was the map operation. And so in the original action is just sending over the type and the ID. We're going to replace this with payload, but we're not just going to set ID to payload. The way that map and filter in Redux-Concise works is that the payload that you send is actually the mapping/filtering function that is going to be used to map or filter over your state. So we're just going to literally grab the mapping function and delete this action because we don't need it anymore. Save. And fingers crossed, we should be good. It works. And we can toggle. So it all works. And as you can see, we basically went from all of this code to 4 lines, while still being pretty clear as to what's going on. Like you know what map does, you know what push does. So it's not trying to be like overly magical or overly implicit. The previous versions, if you take a look at it tonight, are a little bit too magical, but this API is a little bit nicer, I think. So now you might be thinking, that's cool, but like, what if I need to do something that isn't just push, pop, filter, whatever, toggle Boolean value? What if I need to do something complex, unique? And that's actually totally fine with Redux-Concise. We go over to my next demo. This is just a simple counter. It works as you would expect. You click, it increments, decrements. If we look at the reducer, it's pretty simple. It just increments the state by 1 or decrements the state by 1, depending on what action it receives. And so let's say you have an application that has like a bunch of counters around for some reason, and you want to sort of create a repurposed like counter reducer that you can use in multiple places. With Redux-Concise, you can actually create your own custom reducer creators with a function that every reducer creator comes stock with as a property called add handlers. So I can do something like const create counter reducer. And then I can, oh, actually, I forgot to import. All right. So create value reducer, add handlers. And this is just a function that literally takes an object of action handlers, the same thing that the original create reducer took. So let's say I want to have the ability to do create counter reducer dot handlers dot increment. So I can just create a key called increment and write out an increment function. Okay, and I can do the same thing for decrement. Okay, and now I can use this to the same way that I could have with any of the default reducer creators to create our new counter reducer. So we can have const counter, create counter reducer, and we'll default it to 0. And then the action is increment. And we can set that to create counter reducer dot handlers dot increment. And we can do the same thing for decrement. Okay, so let's export this. And it should work. Yep. All right, so not only did we create our own reducer creator in this example, but we even created a reducer on top of that, and it's still less code than using the original switch statement reducer. So pretty cool. So there's just one more thing that I want to talk about. That's like basically it for like the meat of the talk. But I wanted to talk about some like new things that are going on in React. Do any of you guys keep up with React or know what's been going on lately? Yeah. So there are a couple of new features called hooks and suspense that have been really big, and so React is like sort of in a transformative period, I guess. And there's been a lot of hype about Redux not really being necessary anymore, especially after like React Cache comes around and stuff like that. So I'm sitting here writing this library about Redux at a time when Redux may not be relevant anymore, and so I was a little bit worried. And then I checked the hooks API, and there's actually a hook for React now called useReducer, which basically allows you to use Redux-style reducers in your plain old React applications. And what's really cool about that is that reducers, there's nothing really special about them. They're just plain JavaScript functions. The only special thing about them is the actions. But React actions work the same way that Redux ones do. So this library is actually still relevant because you can use it to create reducers for your React hooks applications now. Yeah, that's really all I wanted to talk about. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you, Shamoon. Yeah.
Questions? I have a question to kick off. Are you looking for help with the project?
Yeah, if anyone wants to contribute, yeah, by all means, hit me up. Post on GitHub.
Cool. What else? Who's got a question? Or comment? Or concern? Or suggestion? Or limerick? No limericks.
I have a question for you guys though. Did you guys think that like the coding stuff was like too slow? Like I should have just had like commented out pieces of code that I uncommented and like magically it works, or the coding was fine?
I
Cool.
thought it was pretty cool one-handed.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
You may want to set up in the code what you're doing because
What do you mean?
typing away.
Oh
Say,
yeah.
oh, then I'm going to do this,
Yes.
then I'm going to do that.
I see. So like having imports ready and stuff like that.
So do like if you're going to do that, do like a flow chart that says, here's the state diagram. Right?
Okay. Yeah. I see what you're saying. Yeah. Thank you.
Cool. Who else has a question? Going once, going twice. I, for one, am actually going to look at this because I hate Redux with a passion, mostly because of this.
You don't have to use it. There's context.
Yeah. But I might. So, thank you.
Thank you.
All right.